As Mike said, this will be sort of a two-parter. This will be the next couple of weeks, generosity and greed. And we'll cover both topics. We'll contrast the two each week. So we'll start tonight with greed and contrast that with what generosity looks like. So if you want to start off, we'll be in Proverbs chapter 11. And Proverbs has a lot to say about how to handle money. I think we just went through that even with Pastor Gordy, if you were here last week. Lending, money management, and there's a lot that comes with it. And when it comes to the concept of how we use our money, generosity is often in the context of the poor and how we can treat them. And while Proverbs has something to say about that, we can maybe think of somebody who might even have more to say about that, and that's Christ. So we'll start in Proverbs, see what Proverbs has to say, the principles that we can apply, and then we'll see what Christ has to say about it in the New Testament and a few other places with a few other examples as well. But Christ, you think of the parables, you think of his Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. He cared deeply for the poor. That's who he came to save. He didn't come to save many noble, many proud, yet the poor. So first, we gotta establish some definitions, as is tradition. Generosity is this idea of giving willingly, often associated with nobility, and the Mosaic Law set up standards for the Jews, just like we learned about with lending. So with the Mosaic Law, there were terms for gleaning the fields. You can farm, you can harvest, but you leave a little bit for the others. If you drop something, you don't pick it up. When you go through and you harvest your grapes, you can grab the grapes you see, but don't pass through and grab any others. There needs to be some provision for the less fortunate. Can anybody think of someone whose life was changed by gleaning? Yeah, there it is. Okay, Ruth. That's always the one I think about as well. So Ruth, that's how she and Boaz basically got connected, was her opportunity to glean his fields. So generosity, it's even worked into the law. Now, what about greed? And what I'd like us to remember throughout the lesson. I know Jesse doesn't like the word. The lesson tonight is that greed is sin, and sin every time is always a lie. So just like any other sin that we indulge in, does the promised effect last? The answer is no. If I lie, do my problems disappear? No. If I lust, am I satisfied? No. If I covet, am I content? All these things we've all maybe indulged in before, and every single time you come to the end of it, you realize you're still left wanting. So just like the rest, when we give in to greed and hold back what maybe we could have given or maybe what we owed, the end result is never satisfaction. Instead, it's want. And this will be the main point throughout our discussion of generosity and greed. Greed is a lie. Generosity is the truth. And if we can remember that throughout our daily lives, every situation, then we will be satisfied now and in eternity. So if you're in Proverbs chapter 11, we're going to start in verse 24 as an example to get us started. Proverbs 11:24 says, "There is one who scatters and yet increases all the more. And there is one who holds back what is rightly due and yet results only in want." The ESV, if you're holding that translation in your lap, reads it like this: "One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give and only suffers want." So on the generosity side of things, I hope we can all think of people that this reflects, maybe even yourself at some point. Proverbs 11:24, like many of the Proverbs, is not a direct recipe for earthly riches, but it is sometimes the case, isn't it? Just to reread, "One gives freely, yet grows all the richer." So if you can think of a time that, or someone you know, took time to be generous, you go through it with it, this opportunity presents itself, you accept the opportunity, only to be repaid by that thing or even more later on. You can think back, maybe you did count the costs before you were generous, but then, through conviction or whatever it might have been, you decided to be generous, and then later on, maybe sooner than later, God repays you with the same thing. Not always the way it works, but sometimes that is the way God works. Regardless, though, of how you are blessed when you give. Paul goes on to record in Acts that Jesus Christ said, it's more blessed to give than to receive. Now, to handle the other side of that verse, and I like starting here because it just contrasts the two nicely to give us sort of an example. And something to note in this verse is the position of the person here. It isn't that they had the opportunity to be generous and decided not to. They actually owed someone something and decided not to pay what they were obligated to pay. And what's embarrassing is it might be easier to see yourself in the later part of the verse than the earlier. It's easy to imagine what it feels like to withhold from someone and then for that not even to satisfy us. You have this opportunity presented to you. You could be generous. And you think, I better look after myself instead. And then time goes by and you're full of regret. And you might even be able to think about those particular situations now and think, I could probably still pay that person for whatever it might have been. When I had the opportunity to show grace and be generous to a person, but instead I chose myself, what did I really gain? So for the rest of our time, the specific forms of greed and generosity I'd like to focus on is the contrast between unjust gain, that sort of greed, and generosity towards the undeserving. So we'll break down other types of greed, get into specifics next week, but this week will be unjust gain, and then generosity towards the undeserving. Turn to Proverbs chapter 1. In Proverbs chapter 1, beginning in verse 8, Solomon commands his son with regards to behave around sinners. In short, stay away from them. Do not walk with them. And Solomon talks about how the sinner is actively ruining their own life. And we'll pick up in verse 18. But they lie in wait for their own blood, these sinners that Solomon's writing about. They ambush their own lives. So are the paths of everyone who is greedy for gain. It takes away the life of its possessors. And turn to chapter 15 real quick. Similar application, similar principle. Chapter 15, verse 27 says, he who is greedy for gain troubles his own house, but he who hates gifts of bribery will live. So greedy for unjust gain. And, I say unjust even though that word is not in at least the Legacy translation. In the NASB, if you have that, it says everyone who gains by violence in chapter 1, and in chapter 15 it says who profits illicitly. So the word here is batza, and it's typically associated negatively in context. So this is the sort of greed that is used in the context of thieves, murderers, anyone looking to take what isn't rightfully theirs, the IRS. And, I was hoping somebody would wake up for that. Who hasn't, though, thought about, what would I do with $1 million? So the difference here is the method in which you obtain the $1 million, these schemes that you might play out in your mind. So we read stories about the lengths people will go to in order to gain unjustly, robbery, murder, insurance fraud, deceit, bribes, you name it. We get very creative when it comes to the opportunity to increase our wealth. If there's a shortcut to it, we've attempted it at least once, and that's exactly what the flesh is prone to do. It's lazy, so why work hard when I could just take a shortcut instead? And this is where we'll leave Proverbs for now. We're going to look at an example. So turn to Joshua chapter 7. So back in your Bible, Old Testament, and think for a second while you're turning here, just put yourself in their shoes. You're homeless. Not only are you homeless, but everyone around you is homeless and will be or has been for 40 years. It's impossible to get ahead in life because you're just trying to survive. All of the surrounding nations hate you and want to kill you. They even attempt to curse you. Then suddenly, life turns around for a moment. There have been victories, but there's been this recent victory. There aren't survivors. Their homes are decimated, and all their property is just lying there for you for the taking. Again, you've got nothing. You've been wandering around homeless for years. And now suddenly there's this house that no one is living in anymore. But God said not to take it. So up until that last little detail, why wouldn't you take it? It's the opportunity is right there. It's a quick way to get out of this hole. The owners are gone. You have nothing but a tent to call your own. And that's exactly what Achan did. So if you're familiar with the story of Jericho, they walked around the walls came down. The only survivor permitted was a harlot who stashed some spies for Israel, and she and her family, anyone in her household, they would be preserved. Everything else, some to be given to the Lord, the rest destroyed. But one man named Achan took the opportunity to gain unjustly, and he was found out. Start in verse 19. We're going to read through a few verses here. Joshua 7, verse 19. Joshua said to Achan, "My son, I implore you, give glory to Yahweh, the God of Israel, and give praise to him, and declare to me now what you have done. Do not hide it from me." So Achan answered Joshua and said, "Truly, I have sinned against Yahweh, the God of Israel, and this is what I did. I saw among the spoil a beautiful mantle," this is like a cloak, "from Shinar, and 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold, 50 shekels in weight. Then I coveted them and took them, and behold, they are concealed in the earth inside my tent with the silver underneath it." Verse 22. So Joshua sent messengers. They ran to the tent, and behold, it was concealed in his tent with the silver underneath it. And they took them from inside the tent and brought them to Joshua, to all the sons of Israel, and they poured them out before Yahweh. Then Joshua and all Israel with him took Achan the son of Zerah, the silver, the mantle, a bar of gold, his sons, his daughters, his oxen, his donkeys, his sheep, his tent, and all that belonged to him, and they brought him up to the valley of Achor. And Joshua said, "Why have you troubled us? Yahweh will trouble you this day." And all of Israel stoned him with stones, and they burned him with fire after they had stoned them with stones. Then they raised him over a great heap of stones that stands to this day, and Yahweh turned from his burning anger. Therefore, the name of that place has been called the Valley of Achor to this day. So, and by the way, not only did Achan decimate himself, his sin, the reason that people were starting to even question, how would it even be discovered that somebody has something hidden in the tent or in the dirt underneath their tent? The reason it came about is because Israel was losing a very easy battle. And Joshua's confused. God, you've given me victory time and time again. This should be a clean sweep. But it was revealed, no, somebody disobeyed and somebody took what was not theirs. And I think it's a perfect picture of greed. Did Achan even enjoy the things that he took? No, he buried them in the ground. All the things that he saw and he took pleasure in and that he coveted, he stuck in the dirt and never even used it. And then God withheld victory from Joshua in the beginning of chapter 7 because of his disobedience. So all the people around him are suffering, people die, and he didn't even get to enjoy what he took. So people are harmed even outside of Achan and just his family. Next up, for our example of unjust gain, turn to Acts chapter 5. We're going to take a look at a church family, a little bit more close to home. So at this point in Acts, and the early church for that matter, things are going all right. The gospel is spreading. A few disciples have been arrested, but then they're released. They're still preaching the word. Now, the church needs funding for this new group of people referred to as the Way, the early church. They need some funds to keep going. And this next example of unjust gain isn't the traditional sense. These people weren't out for monetary reward, I don't believe. I think it's safe to assume that their motive was for social reward, maybe in addition to the money that they got to keep behind. And we'll go on to contrast this group, and we'll transition to generosity, because I think that's exactly what motivated them. Chapter 5, verse 1 of Acts. A man named Ananias, with his wife Sapphira, they sold a piece of property and kept back some of the price for himself with his wife's full knowledge. So far, so good. But bringing a portion of it, he laid it at the apostles' feet. But Peter said, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and to keep back some of the price of the land? While it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? And after it was sold, was it not under your authority? Why is it that you have laid this deed in your heart? You have not lied to men, but to God. So this couple, they witnessed the generosity, if you just look back a few verses, they witnessed the generosity of another, Barnabas, and they followed in step, except they wanted to keep some of the profits for themselves while leading the church to believe otherwise. So maybe you've had the desire to at least let people know just how generous you are. Maybe you've done a good thing and now it's just itching. You got to tell someone how nice you are, how generous and thoughtful you have become. Or like Ananias, maybe you've even lied about the details of your generosity. Why would we do that? Giving any amount would be glorifying to God, but sometimes we like to inflate the answer. And the next person that asks, that number gets a little bit bigger. The opportunity that we took to help someone, it's even grander than before. And sometimes my wife and I joke about this, what we thought about doing but we didn't do for each other, just to get some brownie points on the board for ourselves. Hey, I thought about bringing you home this. I didn't, but I thought about it. And I attempt to gain unjustly there. Or, I keep $20 in my pocket at all times just in case there's an opportunity to give. That is not true. It sounds nice, though, and it makes you think like, wow, Austin's a pretty generous. I should start. We should all maybe. But just things like that where you think, wow, people are going to think highly of me if they believe these things about me. So in both examples, how did God retaliate when it came to greed for unjust gain? In the case of Achan and in the case of Ananias and later Sapphira on in this section. They died on the spot. And one just a little bit while after the fact. So for one, how fortunate are you and I that God doesn't punish us immediately for our own pride and our own greed. So remember, what we're setting up here is greed for unjust gain contrasted towards the generosity to the undeserving. So Achan, Ananias, his wife Sapphira, they had one person in mind, which was themselves. They looked after them, me, myself, and I, and took no regard for God and even lied to him. So it's easier to be selfish. That's the way the flesh is wired us. That's what we're prone to being. But has that ever been worth it? You think about the times that you have withheld, the ways that you have been greedy in life, and enough time goes on, you can barely remember what it was for. But God does, and it'll all be burned up if you're a believer, thankfully, or it'll be counted against you in eternity. But they, and sometimes we believe the lie. And every time greed creeps in, every time you think for a second, I should keep this for myself or I should obtain this for myself, try to remember it's a lie. You don't have it now, which means you don't need it. God hasn't given it to you. And if you trust that, if you believe in it, hopefully generosity comes a little bit easier. So whatever you think you gain by taking for yourself will be lost. So what does generosity towards the undeserving look like? If I don't want to be greedy, if I want to be generous, what does that look like? Unlike unjust gain, where all I'm thinking about is how quickly I can serve myself, generosity towards the undeserving seeks to serve God and others. So keep your finger in Acts, because we're going to be there in just a second. But turn to Proverbs chapter 19. We'll go back to Acts because what motivated, in my opinion, Ananias and Sapphira is exactly what we'll read about. But in Proverbs chapter 19, verse 17, it says, "He who is gracious to the poor lends to Yahweh, and he will repay him for his bountiful deed." So I mentioned this earlier, but I do believe Ananias' motivation was for attention. We're going to read here in Acts chapter 4 just how well thought of and noble another member of the church was looked at because of his generosity. You see one person, they do something nice, everyone praises them for it, and now you kind of want a piece of it as well. So let's see what generosity looks like. Verse 32, back in Acts chapter 4. And the congregation, remember this is the early church, of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and not one was saying that any of his possessions was his own. But for them, everything was common. And with great power, the apostles were bearing witness to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. For there was not a needy person among them, for all who were owners of land or houses would sell them and bring the proceeds of the sales, and lay them at the apostles' feet, and they would be distributed to each as any had need. Now Joseph, a Levite of Cyprian birth, who was called Barnabas by the apostles, which translated means son of encouragement, and owned a field, sold it, brought the money, and laid it at the apostles' feet. So we got the early church, which was one soul. It says, one soul, one heart, and they considered anything that they had not to be their own. They considered it says, common. They wanted to share it with anyone who had need, willingly. So this wasn't expected of Barnabas. He saw the need, he took the opportunity to fulfill it, and as a result, there was not a single person left that was needy in the church. So this person, he received the son of encouragement as a nickname, sold his place, and brought the entire sum of the proceeds to the church. Again, I'll just reread Proverbs 19:17. It says, "He who is gracious to the poor lends to Yahweh, and he will repay him for his bountiful deed." So do you remember that when you have opportunities to be gracious? Do you consider yourself to be lending to God? There's really no better investment strategy than that. Anyone heard of a tariff? I'm just saying, there would be a lot better results if we just lent to God instead. And there's several ways that we can, the church, the poor, but it's any opportunity that God presents to you that you hear. You hear somebody has a need, think immediately, how can God use me to fulfill this need? Anytime God gives you the opportunity to be gracious, you are lending to him. And what's even harder to understand is that it's his to begin with. You're just giving back. You're sharing what God has given you. And if you can remember that nothing that you have is yours, it's all God's to begin with, it's very easy to give somebody else's stuff away. I volunteer that up all the time. And that's what we're doing. Everything I have and don't have was given to me by God. Any of the opportunities I have to be generous are really just opportunities to share what he's given me. Turn to Luke chapter 6. We'll see what Jesus has to say about the matter of being generous. This is a radical example. It's Christ's words, and it sets a standard for us. This is in the context of enemies, first of all. It's not just your friends and loved ones. Luke chapter 6, verse 30 says, "Give to everyone who asks of you, and whoever takes away what is yours, do not demand it back." Skip down to verse 35. "But love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. And your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he himself is kind to the ungrateful and evil. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful." So I don't even understand fully, and I don't think many of us do, consider just how irresponsible this is practically. This passage is primarily in the context of how you treat your enemies, and to make this order even taller, these are enemies. These are not your friends. These are not your allies, your family. We don't often have many enemies, but consider the person you dislike the most. Hopefully there aren't very many. But giving them money, or if somebody takes from you, you don't demand it back. There couldn't be a more opposite action to greedy for unjust gain than to allow an enemy to keep what they have taken from you. But that's the testimony we're supposed to have with all of our enemies, as well as the poor, the needy, the sojourner. Take a look at Proverbs 14. That's exactly what we were discussing. I'll read chapter 14, verse 20. It says, "The poor is hated by his neighbor, but those who love the rich are many." So we know that Jesus, like I said earlier, did not come to save the many nobles. So that leaves a lot of poor, the people the world does not pay attention to. In verse 20, again, Proverbs chapter 14, just to spare you the turning. "The poor is hated even by his neighbor, but those who love the rich are many. He who despises his neighbor sins, but how blessed is he who is gracious to the poor. In verse 31 of the same chapter, it says, he who oppresses the poor reproaches his maker, but he who is gracious to the needy honors him. So do any of us deserve what we've received from God? No, it's all by his grace, undeserved. And where God focuses a lot of his grace is towards the poor. So why wouldn't we? They don't deserve anything, but neither do we. So consider the testimony and impact you can have in a person's life beyond the generosity and the gift, but consider the relationship. Again, Proverbs says they don't have many friends. The people who are downtrodden, they don't have people looking their way. You can think about the way that you behave when somebody is homeless on the side of the street. You might give them some extra space. You might not look their way, let alone give them eye contact. But that's the way that God was handling them. Turn to Proverbs chapter 19 real quick. Just to echo what wealth does in contrast to the poor. And generosity, it's an excellent vehicle for evangelism. Proverbs 19 verse 4 says, wealth adds many friends, but a poor man is separated from his friend. Skip to verse 6. Many will seek the favor of a nobleman, and everyone is a friend to a man who gives gifts. All the brothers of the poor man hate him. How much more do his friends distance themselves from him? He pursues them in words, but they are no more. It's a very tragic reality. The rich, they are very easy to be around. They might even extend some of their riches to you. The offer to pay for something, whatever it might be, give you a gift. They're fun to be around for selfish reasons alone. The poor, they don't have much to offer us, so there's nothing for us to take. And if there is nothing in it for us, why commit to them the time? But that's what Christ did. The time, money, energy, and anything else that you can give, we're to use it generously as an opportunity to share Christ with someone. So we'll start wrapping up with this. We know money to be the root of all sorts of evil. And sometimes, that evil manifests itself in acquiring it unjustly. So Achan, he saw an opportunity to get some new clothes, precious metals, the easy way. Ananias and Sapphira, they witnessed what it looks like to gain unjustly by lying about the status of their giving and their opportunities. Do we tolerate unethical practices ourselves in the pursuit of unjust gain? Maybe it's unethical business because it doesn't seem to be hurting anybody else. It's a lot easier if we just do it this way. I know there are laws that say to do it this way, but it is unjust. Or if you're in the position to pay someone, do you pay them less than what they've earned? How about, taxes? That's always the common one. Are you honest? What about, the other government systems that may require something of you? Do you take credit for the work of another? There's a lot of ways that we can get ahead unjustly. And it's very attractive to do those things. You think about just how attractive the lottery is to many people. I'm not saying that that's unjust, but the opportunity to gain quickly with little effort, it's very appealing. And to do things unjustly is appealing as well. So an infinite number of ways that we can create to feed our greed, and we can easily do that unjustly. Or we can do what God calls us to do and be generous with what he's given us. So if someone asks for something, you give it expecting nothing in return. Spoke with someone recently, and they wondering why they should do anything nice for anyone unless they would be thankful for it, unless they would be appreciative or maybe offer them a favor as a result. And that's not the attitude we're supposed to have. We're supposed to give freely, lend with an open hands. Gordy read in Deuteronomy 15 last week. You lend freely, open your hands. If somebody has a need, be ready to meet that need in any means that you possibly can. So if God calls us to be generous with what he's given us, do you take those opportunities? If someone asks for something, do you do it? They don't need to deserve it and hardly ever do. You can think of the things and the times where you've deserved something or somebody thought you deserved something and in your heart, I haven't deserved anything. God has been gracious to us, and in return, we can be gracious to others. Turn to Luke chapter 6. We'll go to a couple more passages. The recipients of our generosity don't always need to be our friends, but hopefully, you are generous towards your friends. But we should be intimately familiar with the friends. And I think that's why it's easier to be generous to them. We know about their life circumstances. Hopefully you're serving alongside them. Hopefully you have Bible studies, time with each other, that you do get to know one another. And those are the opportunities I enjoy, where you hear about a need, you hear about an opportunity, somebody standing behind you in line to pay for something, the same thing that you're about to pay for. These little opportunities that you can take to be generous and show Christ. You hear a budget is tight. Buy dinner, buy a gift card, whatever it might be. You hear about a medical issue. You hear about projects. I think about the many projects around here that people are very generous with their time in. But I think we might generally do a good job praying when these situations arise, but we can do more. James chapter 2, I know you're in Luke. James chapter 2, verse 15 says, "If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed and be filled,' yet you do not give to them what is necessary for their body, what use is that?" And prayers are always appreciated. But also consider maybe your generosity is the answer to somebody's prayer. Not that you're God, but God that may be using you to meet their needs. And that's exciting. You might have no idea that it's been on their heart, it's been weighing down on them, but you hear of a need, you hear of a cost, something that's detrimental, car issues that come up. Take those things, hear it as an opportunity, and try to do something about it. Sometimes I know our friends can be stubborn and refuse, so do it in roundabout, creative ways. But consider how you can be a servant to others, because it's good to pray. It is. But just like James says, what use is it if I say, "Go in peace, be warmed and be filled," yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body? What use is that? So do you consider that your generosity might be the answer that God is going to use to their prayers? And finally, just to kick it up a gear, you're in Luke chapter 6, be this way with your friends as well as your enemies. So verse 32, just a few verses before what we read earlier, it says this: "And if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even the sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even the sinners do the same." So I think, our church family, the friends that you've had for years, maybe decades, we're looking out for them. And I hope we are. That's the role of the church. You think back to early church in Acts, and again, everything was common. And I think we're good at looking out for one another in these ways and seeing how we can help. But what feat is that, relatively speaking? God will honor you for it. You will be glorified. But if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? What's hard, where you start to really demonstrate Christ, is towards that person that doesn't deserve it. Towards that person that they've made these mistakes. You can't believe the place that they've put themselves in. Now, we don't want to enable people, but we do need to be generous and care for our enemies. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even the sinners do the same. So keep your eyes and ears open for opportunities to be generous with what God's given you. Flee from the temptation to gain unjustly and get ahead of where God has you. When the thought, and this is usually the first thing that comes to mind when an opportunity to approach itself, is, what will this cost me? And if you can remember, every time that thought comes in that it's a lie, I think we would be a lot more generous. Anytime I have to write something up like this, I'm just usually talking to myself, and I hope everybody else feels the same way. But that's the way it is a lot of the times, at least for myself. You have an opportunity. It could be something as simple as a coffee. Hey, I'm in line in front of them. I know they're about to order after me. I could just pay for them. And then insert any other sort of rationale that you might have. So be thinking, how can I lend to God? How can I give to someone else what he's given to me? The truth is that God has given you an opportunity to give, and you will be rewarded for it. So if we're lending to God and God's holding it in the account for us and we get to be repaid for it in eternity, how much better is that than any sort of investment, any sort of savings, any sort of return that we could get here? If you have the opportunity to give, you have the opportunity to pay attention to somebody that Proverbs says the world pays no attention to, use that opportunity. Use that as an opportunity to share him, to not give credit to yourself like Ananias and Sapphira tried to do, but when they ask you, or they might be wondering, why is this person the way they are? Why are they so generous? Finally, why did this person take note of me? And well, Christ did, and I'm supposed to live the way Christ lived. Let's pray, and we'll move on with our evening. God, thank you for your word. Thank you for the many principles that we can apply from Proverbs. Thank you for the truth of your word and the examples that you give in the New Testament for us, the examples on the opposite end from Achan and Ananias and Sapphira. I pray that we'll read these stories, we'll think about them in ways that we might relate. Unfortunately, our lives do parallel many of these stories. The things that we've taken, the things that we've hoarded for ourselves with the expectation that maybe one day we'll use them, only to find out it's worthless. Maybe even the desire for that thing goes away over time. I pray that we'll be reminded of those thoughts, reminded of those opportunities as time goes on, that greed is never the truth. It's always a lie, and the opportunities that we have to give should be taken every single time that we have the opportunity to do so. In Christ's name, amen.